So my name is Andrew Nelson. I'm with Red Hat, here to talk about Ansible, essentially the missing piece. We're going to talk about what is Ansible, what is Ansible Tower. A lot of what I've done here is done inside Ansible Tower, but we'll speak a little bit about why that was chosen specifically. We're also going to talk about tying Ansible Tower into Zabbix so that you can use Zabbix as a source of truth, a source of inventory for Ansible Tower to run your Ansible playbooks against. And then also how we can leverage Ansible Tower and Ansible playbooks to perform automated remediation for issues that are discovered within Zabbix. So who am I? As I mentioned earlier, I'm Andrew Nelson. I'm a senior Linux consultant in North America with Red Hat. I've been involved with the Zabbix community for a long time, over 15 years. I was the original author of the first API library. It was written in Ruby, ZBX API. I've also maintained the original Zabbix bot in IRC, which actually just came online today for the first time in a while. Had a hardware crash that it was sitting on, so it was a little challenging. And I've been, as you can see, involved with Linux for quite a while now. So let's move into it. So what is Ansible? Ansible is essentially an orchestration and configuration management solution. It is often said to be agentless. However, many people will say, hey, if I require something on the remote machine, then that's not truly agentless. Yes, it does have some requirements in terms of Python being on the remote client machine and that you have access method to get into it. The default access method that Ansible leverages is SSH. So Python 2.6 happens to be installed by default in most Red Hat derivatives. Most of our libraries run with Python, so you're going to find that by default on almost every Red Hat derivative, and for the most part today on most Linux distributions. One of the things that's worth pointing out, the design is rather functional in nature. So you tend to write things of, here's my environment, here's my inventory, what it says, and configuration data. Here's my function that I'm going to do, which is going to result in a configuration as it sits on this system. It's not deterministic like some of the others. Puppet can be similar to that. CF Engine, where you might interrogate your system, find some information, collate it all together, and then run some procedures to generate all the data that you're looking for. The playbooks are written in YAML format, so that's how they're placed together. It's a very straightforward format once you begin to understand it. One of the key things to remember if you're doing Ansible is pay attention to your spacing. YAML really requires spacing to be correct, especially when you're dealing with the various modules and the parameters that go to the modules and figuring out what goes where. Jinja 2, if any of you guys have ever used that, is a very powerful templating engine. That's what Ansible leverages for a lot of the file templating capabilities and even templating itself within the playbooks. The way that variables and so forth are handled within the playbooks is actually via Jinja templating. So it's kind of interesting. So Ansible Tower is essentially a web interface, if you will, to running your playbooks. It also provides a bunch of other features which are quite useful as well. Some of which is it provides some role-based access controls, so I can create a playbook that's a privileged playbook that might perform some privileged operation. I can take one of my junior sysadmins in my environment. I can put this playbook into Tower, give my junior admin access to this playbook to operate it and to use it, but I do not have to tell my junior sysadmin any of my user credentials to log into the system, any credentials to escalate my user privilege on the other side, and so forth. If I were to use Ansible Core, I would have to, I can place all this into a vault. However, I still have to give them a vault password. And the vault password does allow you to then unencrypt the Ansible vault and see everything inside of it. So yes, there are some ways to do similar things in Ansible Core, but Ansible Tower does provide a nice seamless interface to it. Plus, the other nice thing about Ansible Tower is you can go back in time and have a look at your playbooks and what was the output of your playbooks and so forth. Another one is the ability to create workflows where I'm going to run this playbook first, and then I'm going to do this action. If that fails, I'm going to do another action, and then follow-on action, and so forth. Yes, you can once again do that in Core, but Tower does make that a lot more straightforward and simple. One thing that is also nice about Tower, and we'll talk about this in a little bit later, is there is a REST API. So whatever is in Tower, I can go ahead and call it directly using the REST API. And also recently was announced within the last week is the upstream project to Ansible Tower is the AWX project. As you guys may know, Ansible was a recent acquisition by Red Hat within the last year or so. And one of the major questions that many of our customers have had, and many people that I've worked with and talked with have said, hey, where's the open source version of Tower? You know, it's a closed source version. You guys are an open source company. Why do you have a closed source software? Well, the usual one is we have a history of open sourcing our software. Just give it time. It will happen most likely. And here it is today. So you can download that, and there's configuration files to essentially create a Docker image, then run AWX inside of a Docker image. So what does Ansible look like? Here's a very, very simple YAML file, an Ansible Playbook. This Ansible Playbook will essentially just connect to a remote machine, the client that we've got configured. It will change the MOTD, the message of the day, to be, hello Ansible world. As you can see, the module that I'm running here is the copy module. I'm going to place the contents of this string in the file. I'm going to place it in that destination. Those are the permissions I'm going to have to the file. The SE Linux contexts are also listed there. The file is also going to be owned by root. And we're going to run this playbook on every host. So that's one thing you'll find a lot of times is your playbooks will be written to be the largest group necessary to perform your task because you can later on do a subset of your inventory. So you essentially can choose to either group yourself at this level inside your playbook or group yourself later on in terms of selecting a subset of your inventory to actually execute upon. So let's talk about what we're here really to talk about, which is tying Ansible and Zabbix together. So we have a scenario where, this is a very common one, as many of us know that Zabbix doesn't provide a capability to manage the Zabbix agent configuration. So how do we manage this? Many of us have used other methods of just from a straight install script, a bash script that does it. I've heard people using CF Engine here today. Puppet's is a very common choice as well. Chef, I've heard Salt used by a bunch of other people. So there's many tools that are out there. So one thing we can also use Ansible as another tool we can add to that tool chest, if you will. So what we do is we tell Tower to talk back to Zabbix to pull its inventory from there. And then when it runs its playbook to do the configurations, we can place the playbooks down onto the agents and go from there. One of the things that's worth noting about the design that I'm showing here today is this assumes that the client machine does not have the Zabbix agent already installed in it. The agent will be installed when you go into Zabbix and you create your new client in Zabbix. And so forth. One of the things that's also worth noting, Zabbix, the host entry and the DNS entry are not the same. They're tied together, of course, but when you refer to it by the host entry. In Ansible, the default is the host name essentially is the actual routable name to the host. You can override that with something else. So let's say I just have web server. Well, web server is not a routable name necessarily, but in Zabbix I may call it web server, but my DNS name may be something else or an IP address. So it will override that here when it creates the inventory. Another thing that's also worth noting about the script that we're using here, spaces inside of templates can cause, or inside of inventories can cause challenges, especially when it comes to grouping later. So if my host name has a bunch of spaces in it, we need to convert those to underscores. The script also places templates into what are called host groups in Ansible, and it appends a TEMPL statement in front of everything, essentially allowing you to remember, hey, this is a templated group of hosts, so forth. So another thing that's also worth noting is the original script that's out in the Ansible community to work with Ansible Core doesn't necessarily run under Ansible Tower right away. Most of that's because the ini file that is necessary to store the Zabbix server credentials that you use for login, it doesn't know how to find that because the script for the plugin that you use for inventory is placed into a temp directory and then executed from there. So what is our approach? So when you're going to do this, first thing you're going to need to create, of course, is some kind of source code repository. This is going to be the place where you're going to store all of your playbooks of some kind. It just so happens that I have a GitLab server at home and that's where I placed all my stuff. After we've done that, then we're going to need to write our playbook to configure our agent. Because remember, I talked about that this is going to be designed around the principle of the agents not already on the host by default. So in this scenario, I happen to have written a Ansible role that performs all the steps necessary to install the agent. As you can see, my script is written to run against all hosts, and it will go from there. The role is available in the link I will provide at the end for GitHub repo of all the scripts that were used and everything else. Then we write another playbook to configure our templated items. And as you notice here, we have hosts, and we basically calling a template group. Because when the inventory script comes in, it also looks at, hey, what inventory or what templates are used, what hosts are in those various templates. Let's place them into a group inside Ansible, and then we can leverage that group name inside of our playbook. So any host that happens to leverage our squid template in Zabbix will now have its various parameters configured and deployed out within, by Ansible and so forth. And I had a role that was created for that as well. So now we go back into Tower and we create a project. We have to have, the project is essentially the link to where the information is stored in our source code repository. So once we do that, then we add our inventory script into the Zabbix, or into Ansible Tower. And then we start creating our templates of jobs. The reason for this step is tied into the role-based access control like I was talking about earlier. You'll have your playbook inside your source code management, which is inside your project, but in order for Tower to execute the playbook, you have to create a job template. So we create our job template, both of them, we have to create one for both, and then we come along and create our final workflow template, which is, like I mentioned earlier, a workflow. So we create our workflow. Our first step of our workflow is going to be update the inventory. We're going to set this workflow to run every hour. So the first step is we want to refresh the inventory from Zabbix that's in Tower and run from there. After we've refreshed our inventory, let's do our agent deployments. Let's make sure our agents are out there and deployed correctly. And then irrespective of whether that last step completed successfully or not, we want to run the final step of deploy your template configurations. So let's say we have 5 agents that refuse to install during the first step there, or during our second step. Well, we don't want that to then prevent the final step from running, because we could have 500 Zabbix agents out there, and just because 5 failed, we don't want to prevent the deployment of our template configurations as well. So we do all that, then we come along and we set up a job, and we schedule our templated workflow to run every hour. So every hour, Tower will go out, refresh inventory, come through, and essentially deploy all of our various configurations that we've got. Now, one thing that's also nice too is, let's say I've added a critical host into Zabbix, and I really want this thing to be monitored very quickly. I can go into Tower and with a click of a button, automate it, or deploy, run that workflow at any time that I want to. So I can run it on an ad hoc basis. One of the things that's also worth noting, because this playbook runs every hour, my inventory gets updated every hour. I don't have, in my configurations, I don't have it set so that Ansible refreshes inventory on every single playbook run. I only refresh inventory once. So that way, for an hour, I've got static inventory, and sure, it may be out of, sync with Zabbix, but, we can at least, have some speed ups in that regard. So now the remediation of issues. So we have a situation where something dies. Zabbix sends an alert action via a call to Tower. Tower then starts a playbook. We then perform the remediation action. In this scenario, it's a very simple remediation action, restart a service. Our remediation action could be something as complex as go hit a load balancer, make sure you hit a database server, and restart a cluster of web servers all at the same time. In various steps. It doesn't, this is a very simple scenario to show it. Here's our playbook that we actually have for remediation. Our first step in the playbook is to restart the squid service on the host that has died. As you see, my playbook to run against all hosts. There's actually a inventory limit that gets tied into the job later on. And then I wrote a module to then tie back into Zabbix to say, hey, I've performed the remediation as a log into the event, so that way it was done. And if the remediation was successful, the event will clear and no problem anymore. If it does not successful, I at least have a note that, hey, Ansible did perform a remediation and so forth. We can add more information if we want to. So once again, we create our job template for remediation. However, we're going to add a second piece to it. We have to add a survey to our job, and the survey is going to ask for the event ID. This is very critical later on because we need to know what event we need to tie our message into. Then we go on to our Zabbix server. We create our event. As you'll notice that we have just a regular event. Now we go to the action for the event, and we're using the Tower CLI. So the Tower CLI program does need to be installed on the Zabbix server because we are going to run this action on the Zabbix server itself. Then we go back over and we maybe test it. So in this case here, I killed squid. As you can see, job number 247 is where it happened. The first thing it did, though, was it refreshed its playbook, so it pulled them all in from my source code repository. And then it ran our remediate squid. And then we go back over to Zabbix, and we can see that very quickly, within 1 minute of it happening, everything came back and was working again. So in conclusion, as we saw here, we can use Ansible and Ansible Tower as a very straightforward mechanism of deploying agent configurations, making sure that your agents have various items that may be required for your templates. Many times we've had to create templates that are very specific, but once again, how do we make sure that those hosts get all of the correct configurations? I mean, we can push them out manually and so forth. Easy to skip a few and so forth. This way we can at least automate that whole process. And also showed a very simple remediation that we can use should there be a problem, and Zabbix can discover that and so forth. All the source code for what I did here today is available up there. I will create a README file at some point describing a little bit more detail some of the other pieces. And I just realized one of the things that is also missing is the simple template that I created up there, but it's pretty straightforward for you guys to understand that one. Thank you.
So the first question, as you work for Red Hat, and as we know, the Red Hat acquired Ansible, are you or Red Hat plan to write more modules to support Zabbix?
I'm not aware of any that are coming directly from Red Hat. Red Hat's a very active member in the open source community. Many of these modules that are actually already in there for Zabbix were part of the Ansible community in general, and we do all of our work in upstream first before we publish it and send it out to our customers as much as we possibly can. So if people do want to have more Zabbix modules, the recommendation is to get involved with the Ansible community, get involved with Ansible core, place those modules up there as best you can, as much as possible, and then eventually, with enough interest, they will, or can find their way into, Ansible Tower and so forth. But Ansible Tower supports everything that Ansible core, already does anyway. So, and we don't at this point in time have a forked version of Ansible that is in the Red Hat repositories. So we, a lot of our Ansible, binaries at this point in time are in EPEL or straight from Ansible. When you install Tower, we have a bundle that happens to have all the pieces necessary. So you don't need EPEL to install Tower, although that's where essentially all the binaries are coming from today. Eventually, I would expect that we'll have an internal repo of some kind. But like I say, getting back to the original one, if you would like to see that happen, get involved with the Ansible community, work with the Ansible community, and then it can find its way into the supported version from Red Hat.
Thank you. Probably the last question from the Slido. Is there any estimates on the open source version of Ansible Tower?
So that was AWX. It's the version that's now out there. AWX project was recent release, and that's like I say, the repo out there will have everything necessary to generate a Docker file, so you can then run AWX inside of a Docker image, and that is the open source. And I would expect going forward, you will begin to start to see versions of Tower being much more closely derived from that. Usually, it took time for us to open source it because there's a lot of legal requirements that necessarily have to go through. I don't know which ones they were. I can't speak to that, but that's often the case that we've had.
Hey, first, congratulations on open sourcing Tower. It's really great. And as I already mentioned, there are quite a lot of community modules for Ansible regarding Zabbix. Have you looked at them? And if you have you vouched on some of them as being well written?
A lot of them were written actually by one company in particular, and I can't remember some of the details. It was kind of interesting. You can tell that they had written mostly for some scenarios that they had. You know, they ask for a lot of the same parameters every time. So a lot of the modules will ask for your Zabbix login and a couple of other parameters like that, rather than maybe using a global variable, which actually that's not an appropriate way. But so you have to pass a lot of the same variables in, log in every single time. It's not necessarily the most efficient way of doing it, and plus, you know, typing a password in is not a very elegant solution. So you'll see the better way to get around that is, you know, use variables and so forth. But there's only about 6 modules now that are written out there. I think it was add host, update host, and a couple others. There weren't many that were related to alerting, you know, which is what I had to do here. But writing a module is actually very straightforward. I have never written one before. I managed to figure out how to do it in about 4 hours. So, you know, given you know the resources out there, I'm not going to say it's easy, but I am going to say it's very straightforward and, you know, and very straightforward to understand and work from there.
Hello.
Yes.
I have one question about Zabbix Ruby API library. Might you know any news about this update for Zabbix 3.4?
Sorry, for which one?
For new Zabbix version. Do you have any updates about Zabbix library?
Oh,
Zabbix
you mean the ones that are in Apple?
Yeah.
So the person who, one person who's involved in that is sitting in the audience. They'll remain nameless at the moment in time, but they're good people. As I understand, there has been some challenges around the Fedora community guidelines and the Fedora requirements for packaging, and hence that's why there haven't been many updates to the package. We can discuss that one offline, and then I can give you more information, you know, about what's going on there.
So thank you very much for your questions.
Thank you.
You, Andrew.
Cheers. Cool.